All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Oliver Blue, and I am your temporary guide on the side for today's workbook lesson 101 out of A Course in Miracles. And I am so delighted to be here. I'm happy that you are here. Again, these messages are being provided by Truly Foundation, a nonprofit organization that is dedicated and devoted to the sharing of advanced spiritualities for the sole purpose of awakening humanity to the awareness of the truth of who they are. It is for the purpose of bringing about transformation in the minds of those that appear here in a body, so that would include everyone. And it's all about bringing harmony to a mind that believes that it's separated from its creator, bringing it back into harmony so that the experience of happiness, joy, and peace can be a direct experience by all humanity, which are all offsprings of the one divine, the one supreme creator that loves us all. And so, with that said, we're going to be looking at workbook lesson 101. And the idea in this lesson states that God's will. So, we're continuing today talking about the will of God. Yesterday, if you remember yesterday's lesson, it says that our part is essential in God's plan for salvation. And salvation is our only function here was lesson 99. Lesson 98, I will accept my part in God's plan for salvation. And so it talks about salvation over the last 3 or 4 lessons being what? God's promise or God's guarantee that all of humanity, which is God's creation, God's only creation, is his son. And when son apparently appeared to have taken on form, we call it humans or humanity. And so God's guarantee is that what he created in the beginning, which was like unto himself, which was formless and timeless, which he calls his son, he calls his offspring, he calls the Christ, he calls the reality, what God created and created like unto himself. That creation remains intact. Nothing has really changed. The only thing that changed is man entertained a tiny mad idea of separation, which plunged him into a detour or to a dream or to a fantasy or into an illusional world or into a state of hallucination, vain imaginings, imagining himself separate from his source. And because of that, we're having to go through this renewal process, this transformational process, to bring that mind that fell asleep back up into an awakened state. And so, again, Truly Foundation, our purpose is to help in that process. And we use A Course in Miracles and other spiritual resources to help us to bring the mind back into a place of discipline, a place for harmony, out of the field of wandering. And so today we're on lesson 101, God's will. Talking about God's will. We remember one of the previous lessons we said there's only one will, and that's God's. So God's will. Even the spiritual teacher guru named Jesus said when he taught the disciples how to pray, it says that God will be done. That was part of what they call the Lord's Prayer. He said, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Why? Because that is the only will that there is. There's no will but God's. But it seemed like there are these individual separate wills when we, from a point of view of this separation, and from the point of view of these body identifications, it seems like each individual has a separate will. But that's only in dreams. There's only one will but God. So he said God's will for us, for his creation, is perfect happiness. You get that? God wills for what he created is is perfect happiness. Why is that? Because that's a part of God's nature, and what God creates, what God extends, is himself. And everything that's in God's nature is in what he creates. So there's innocence, there's perfection, there's peace, there's joy, there's infinite intelligence, there's eternity, and there's happiness. So happiness is a quality of the nature of who we are. It's not something to be bought or attained. It's not something to be what's seeked after. Happiness is not something that resides outside of our nature. Happiness can only be found where God placed it, and he placed it in you and me. Isn't that wonderful? That's great news. And it's great news that is his will for his creation. Perfect. Notice now what he said. It didn't say happiness. He said perfect happiness. Mature happiness. And so we should be the happiest things on the earth when we wake up to the reality of who we are as one with God, sharing the same being that God is. We should be the happiest. All our days should be filled with happiness, regardless of what's happening on the outside, regardless of the situations, circumstances, and conditions, and all the temptation to convince us that we're not the sons and daughters of God. We should be the happiest on earth. We should be. Why? Because it's part of our nature. It's part of God's will. And Jesus said, thy will be done. What is the part of that will? Our happiness, our joy, our peace, our salvation. Salvation meaning what? All of us will eventually wake up to the reality and return to our original state of being, which is sharing the same being that God is, and all the attributes, all the qualities that God is, we are. Because ideas leave not their source. And we're all God's idea. We are all a God idea. Every thought of God can be found within us. Every thought of God is in your aware being, is in your conscious self. It is there. We just have we're not looked there for it. We've looked outside for all these things. And thus we've created a world and a life to search for tomorrow. That's comical. That's a soap opera, search for tomorrow. Well, there's no search for tomorrow. There's only today. And today we have found the will of God for us, which is perfect happiness. All right. What are you going to do about it? God's will is perfect happiness. Say it to yourself. God wills for me is perfect happiness. And just breathe that in, because that is the truth about all of us. That's the truth about who we may think is the most vile and heinous being on the planet. That might be what they are experiencing, but in reality, the will of God for them is perfect happiness. Perfect happiness. And so we're going to go through this, and even as we talk about this, the first part of this really talks about the thing that blocks happiness. We're going to spend the greater part of this discussion talking about the one thing that blocks happiness. And the one thing that blocks happiness is a belief that we continue to have, or there's still some residuals of a belief that we had in separation. When we believe in separation, then what comes with that is what we call the triplets: sin, guilt, and fear. And sin leads the way, or sin consciousness, where there And the whole idea of sin consciousness from the separation point of view is that we had successfully broken the laws of God. Therefore, we are deserving of what? Punishment. And so we fear that punishment. We're guilty for what we did, and then we fear the retribution or the punishment to come. That's the whole idea of sin from man's point of view, in the way that the ego created it to keep us to keep us in alignment, or to keep us humble, or to keep us what we call keep us endorsing the ego thought system. It uses sin, guilt, and fear that comes from the belief in separation. See, the tiny mad idea of belief that we separated, we successfully separated from God, and being here in this form in time and space is evidence of that. That's the ego's lie. And so it plays like parallel to the creation story that we see in biblical reference, that Adam and Eve successfully broke the law of God. Therefore, they were deserving of punishment, and that God put them out of the garden. That was part of their punishment. And that there was this big separation between God and man, this big gulf. And so man went out on his own to make it for himself, because God was mad at him. And so then we know the story of Jesus, which has been put in terms of what Jesus was the Messiah. He came to save, a man from his sin. And God requires the punishment. So God punished Jesus, the innocent lamb. And as a result of God punishing Jesus, we get to go free. And now he paid for the separation that we appear to have successfully created. And so now we've gone scotch-free. But even in that story, in the back of the guy that has accepted the punishment that Jesus paid for us, even the person that had go through that process, he still deals with sin, guilt, and fear. He still has a consciousness of sin. Why? Why? Because there's still a belief that There's still a belief that the separation occurred, and that love was broken, and that God was broken, and God failed, and man failed. And so you could crucify 1,000 Jesus, but it won't get rid of sin, consciousness, and guilt. Why? Because there was apparently, that seemingly there was a break in the action. And anytime there's a break in the action or betrayal, even though you get back together, there's this guilt and sin and fear that remain in our consciousness. There's this inequality that goes with that. And so where there's inequality, where there's sin, consciousness, guilt, and fear, there could be no real love. There could be no real sweetness of fellowship, of communion. Why? Because there's a knowledge of there's something that really did happen. And that's the problem, even in all the traditional religions, that the separation occurred. And as long as there's a belief that the separation occurred, there's a belief in sin, guilt, and fear, regardless of who's been crucified. Even if we crucify ourselves, it doesn't go away. The only way that the idea of separation, sin, guilt, and fear could finally be put to rest is to know that it didn't happen. It's to know that sin is not real from that point of view. To understand that the tiny man idea didn't happen. Separation never did occur. It is impossible for that which is created to be separated from its source. That it was a tiny mad idea. It was a mad, insane idea to think that what we can separate from God. The only solution to it, to sin, guilt, and fear, is to know that it never occurred. And that forgiveness is really not required. It's not necessary because there's nothing to forgive. In reality, there's nothing to forgive. So the idea of separation only happened in dreams and illusions and in imaginings and in fantasies. It's not a reality. So in reality, nothing really happened. Man has not broken God's law. God's law is love, and it can't be broken. Now then, we made a world and created our own laws, and what our own laws are based on what? Punishment. And so in man-made law, there's nothing there's nothing but punishment. And so it's another way for us to punish ourselves for what we believe we done collectively. That's why you see the systems of the justice systems of these world, all based on what? Guilt and punishment. And so what? We get to at least soothe our conscience by seeing humanity get punished for what? For breaking man's law. But remember, even Ephesians chapter 1 of the Bible said that God created us what? Before the foundation of the world, that we be what? Whole, or holy, and without blame before him in love, blameless. But man turned around and created a law and called us blame and guilty. Man will hold us to man's law, yes. But God said, what? You can't break the law. Because there's only the one law, the law of love. And it can't be broken. Only thing can be remotely done where love is concerned is for humanity to fall asleep and go into a dreamlike state and dream of separation and punishment and sin, guilt, and fear. And so on the level that we live from day to day is a level of dreaming until we wake up within the dream to realize what? Nothing really happened. It's called the atonement. And so even in the dream, the memory of God, the memory of our innocence, the memory of our oneness went into the dream with us to gently wake us up to what we call the reality of salvation, the reality of awakening or enlightenment. It's but a recognition that nothing happened. So I want you today and me today to embrace the reality that nothing really happened. Sin does not exist. This is an illusion, just like all the other man-made ideas that we created. This is not a God idea. Sin is not a God idea. I know I said a lot there. That was heavy. But it's the truth that you need to know. And it's the mindset that you got to have to eventually get away from feeling like what? You have to pay. There's a punishment and a penalty to pay. The only way you're going to finally get away from the idea of sacrifice, which is not a God idea. That's a man-made idea. There's no thing as sacrifice in God. Because there's no payment to be made. We don't owe God anything. If we owed God something, God would owe us something. We don't owe God anything. But we owe it to ourselves to be who we are. That's who we owe it to. We owe it to ourselves to be the truth that we are, to experience the truth that we are. And that's why it says right here, God's will for us is what? Perfect happiness. But there can be no happiness where there's what? Sin consciousness. So we have to deal with that, the big S word, as they say. And we're going to deal with that somewhat today. And this happiness presentation. We're going to deal with the S word, because that's still a part of the residual effect of us believing in separation. Separation breeds sin. Sin breeds guilt and fear. Fear of the future. Guilt. We feel guilty now because we feel like we really did accomplish the act of separation. And so we're going to deal with that today. This is a key part of our transformation. This is a key part of our mind training. And that's one reason that the mind has run off as a prodigal from itself. The mind is running in fear. The mind is running away because it believes it's guilty. And we're saying, no, you're not guilty. You're innocent. But the mind says, you don't know what I did. And we say, well, you did all of that in dreams, so it really wasn't real. It would be like a kid waking up from a nightmare and say, Daddy, but you don't know what I did in the dream. You need to whoop me. And Pop and Dad said, no, it was only a dream. It wasn't real. But Dad, it was real to me when I was doing it. And that's kind of comical, but that's kind of where we are. We can't have sustained peace because what? We are believing in the dream. It's like going to a movie, sitting there for 2 hours watching a movie and taking on the persona of one of the characters in the movie who was a villain, who deserved what? Punishment unto death. And we watched that. And then at the end of the movie, we get up and walk out the movie and say, y'all need to punish me. And they say, why do we need to punish you? Because I was a villain in the movie. I was dreaming I was the villain, pretending I was a villain. And he was a bad guy. He needs punishment. So will y'all punish me? They said, no, we're not going to punish you. It was only a movie. That's how kind of insane the whole idea is, that we still carry the residual of a belief in separation. And there's this sense in all of us that there's something wrong with all of us, that we were bad. And then we're born in these bodies, and then we're told we're bad. And we experience being punished as kids. So we think it's part of what? It's just part of this whole life. There's something wrong with us. And, that, we live in a world of sin, guilt, and fear. If you break the law, if you break the law, you can look for the punishment. Our whole system is set up that way. So he says, God's will for us is perfect happiness. Today we will continue with the theme of happiness. Very important. The theme of happiness in this idea of separation is very important for us to understand. Happiness is part of salvation. Salvation is God's promise that we would all eventually come to know ourselves as one with our Creator, sharing the same being, that we're not separate beings. But the being that God is and the being that we are is the same being. We share that one and self-same being. We share the one self-same being. We're part of the source. We're part of the cause. We're not the effects. And so this is a key idea. This is a key idea, knowing that we are perfect happiness. This is a key idea in understanding what salvation means. Knowing that you are perfect happiness. You are that. You're not trying to find it. You're not trying to earn it. You don't have to seek for it, look for it. You are that thing. You are happiness. It says we still believe. It says we still believe that it asks for suffering as penance, as penance, or as payments for our sins. We believe that salvation acts for penance, the part of salvation, the plan of salvation. That is not God's plan. It acts for what? Penance. In man's structure of salvation, somewhere in there, there's a payment or there's a penalty. It acts for penance. And so what? We all escape those that that followed the traditional Christian plan of salvation. We all get to escape because of what? Because of the penalty and the punishment that was levied on Jesus. So that idea was what? Somebody had to pay. There had to be punishment. There had to be a penance. And we believe that. And so we believe that God, if you're in that faith, you believe that God was angry with his creation and he punished it in the one innocent sacrifice called Jesus. Now, to me, to any reasonable person, that makes God an unloving father. Because even natural parents doesn't do that. Even a natural parent doesn't require the death of their son or daughter for breaking their law. That's a merciless father. But we say it's okay for God to be that way. And then we call that God love. And that's what people have a problem with. And they have a right or a reason to have a problem with that. And so it says that this is not. So it says that we still believe it acts for suffering and penance for our sins, even after the death of Christ. There's still a belief. There's still residual that God is still what? Still mad at humanity. And that individually we all going to pay penance for our wrongdoing. So that creates a sense of what we call sin consciousness. We're conscious of being required. We're conscious of wrongdoing, and we're also conscious of the fact that there's a penalty to be paid or a penance to be paid, even though after the death in the crucifixion of Christ, there's still this sense of owing. We owe something. It can't be explained, but it's there. It's called sin consciousness. And where there's sin consciousness, there's guilt. There's the attraction of guilt. We feel guilty. We feel like something is wrong with us because we've done something bad. And then we're conditioned in our upbringing through what our parents punishment system. So all of this is conditioned in us that we've done something wrong, that because of that there's something wrong with us, therefore we all deserve punishment. That's the God of our understanding. That's the God of our upbringing. And they use the Bible to justify it. It's the God of the Bible. The whole Old Testament is based on what? It's based on a priestlyhood where the priest had to atone for the people's sin. And they stood knee deep in blood all the time as people were bringing these innocent animals to be payment for their sin. Bulls and goats, turtle doves, pigeons, all got slaughtered to try to get rid of the guilt. But in all of that blood, all of those killings of those innocent animals, there was still a consciousness of sin. And then Hebrews went on to say that the blood of bull and goats could never remove the consciousness of sin. And I would dare say that even the death of Jesus Christ, who was supposedly a symbol of an innocent human, Even his death doesn't remove the consciousness of sin. Even though Hebrews kind of suggest that, but in reality, you've lived long enough. Some of you guys have, embraced that plan of salvation and still live in a tremendous amount of sin consciousness. The majority of the Christians I know live in sin consciousness and guilt. Why? Because that plan doesn't work. That plan is not the plan of God. It doesn't bring about innocence. It doesn't bring about happiness. Initially, it might feel that way, but as we go on from that original idea, there's still this sense of something is wrong. And there's not this cozy, innocent, open relationship that we feel, that we're supposed to have now. There's still a fear of God. There's still a fear of punishment and penitence that still lingers. Why is that? Well, the Course is telling us why. Because we believe in sin. We believe that we did something wrong. We believe that we actually achieve separation from God, and it's impossible. And then these bodies that we're in becomes the evidence that really happened. And so we still deal with guilt. We still deal with sin consciousness and fear until God has introduced to us his plan of salvation. And he said God's will for us is perfect happiness, and God's plan for salvation has nothing to do with any type of sacrifice. It has to do with a knowing. And what we need to know is that humanity has never and can never separate from its creator. Only in dreams, only in illusions, only in imaginings, only in fantasies. That we are completely the way God created us. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. We're still the formless, timeless creation of God. Just as innocent as God is. And God has never demanded punishment on anyone. It all happened in our minds as we detoured into a dreamlike state and began to hallucinate about an angry God that required penance. It was all in our mind. We dreamed all of that up. Then we wrote books about it. And then we taught every generation to think this way, especially in the West. But in reality, we remain as God created us. These innocent creations of God. That's who we are. That's what this whole training is about. To bring the mind back into reality, that nothing has happened. That all is good, all is joy, all is peace. There's no enmity, never has been. God is love. He's always been love. In God there is no darkness. So in God there is no requirement. There is no sin, there is no guilt. You are free. I am free. You are free. You are as free as God is. I am as free as God is. And so we're going to deal with this subject of sin today from the Course's perspective. Now, like we said at the beginning of these 101 days ago, we said that some of the ideas in these books are going to be startling. And that might be startling to some of you who have been heavily conditioned in this, sin consciousness, heavy conditioned in the belief in sacrifices, heavily conditioned in the belief that God is an unloving Father that would require an innocent sacrifice. If that's your belief system, And that's what needs to be transformed. That's what's creating the problem. It's not what you're doing, it's what you're thinking. And it's the way you're thinking, it's the way you're perceiving. You're perceiving yourself and perceiving others, believing that we all deserve punishment. Then we look upon a world that is what? Gone mad. That's why there's so much killing in the world. That is their way of what? That is their way of trying to get rid of the guilt. It's their way of trying to get rid of the guilt. Is to find it in someone else. But it only magnifies it in them. They have to do more killing. And that's why you have wars and fightings and divisions and shootings and mass shootings. All that is mankind trying to deal with the sin consciousness and the guilt and the fear that follows. And until there is an intervention of truth, until there's an intervention of light, it will continue. And that's why once we wake up from the dream and realize that nothing happened, we remain in the dream as a light to bring others until a state of awakening. That becomes our function, like we read on yesterday. That God gave us the function of salvation. God gave us the function of what? Forgiveness. So we become like what? The saviors of the world without requiring anything. God's plan for salvation doesn't require anything. Because in reality, nothing has happened. And so he says, this is not so. This is not so. What is not so? God does not require penance. God does not require us to suffer. That's not part of God's plan for salvation. It says, this is not so. Yet we must think it is while we believe that sin is real. While we believe that what? Sin is reality. And sin is not reality. It says, so it's going to be so as long as we think that sin is reality. As long as we hold the idea that sin is real, okay, and we know how much that is conditioned in us. The sinner shall die. The sinner shall be punished. The sinner shall this. The sinner shall that. I mean, we got sacred books that people say this is what? This is it. God said, the sinner shall die. The sinner shall be punished. And so this has been programmed into us. That sin is real. And that God's Son can sin. And in reality, what? God's Son can't sin. Why? Because God's Son is not what? A body identification. God's Son remained as he was created. Timeless, formless. This that appear to be in bodies, this is not who we are. But when you identify yourself as a body, then you fall up under what? That dream and the idea of a body that sins. And that's what deserves punishment. And so that's the thinking of the world. But we have to transcend the world's thinking and take on what? The mind of Christ, who says what? We have equality with God. And in God, there is no darkness. Otherwise, in God, there is no sin. So there's no sin in you and your true identity. So which identity are you going to embrace? Your bodily identity or the real you? The real innocent, guiltless, sinless you. It's your choice. And we will experience what we choose. Choose you this day. Who you will serve, what you will serve, what will you endorse? Are you endorsing the reality of who you are as the sinless, guiltless Son of God? Or will you endorse this what? False identity, this body identity? Because the one you endorse is the one you will serve. And you will get whatever that system is set up to what? To give. In God's system, there's only happiness. In the world system, there's sin, guilt, and fear, and punishment. So you see the difference, and you see the choices that we have made, and we have gotten from those choices all our life. And now you have come to a crossroad where you see you can make a different decision. Choose once again whether you will take your place among the saviors of the world as innocent children of God, or remain in hell and keep your brother there, because you want to keep. You don't want to do it. You don't want to be punished by yourself. So we project sin, guilt, and fear on others, and that's the way we see them. We don't see their purity. We don't see their innocence. We don't see their oneness. So that's the ego thought system. A whole thought system was developed out of the tiny amount idea of separation. Are we getting this? This is the reversal that needs to take place in our minds, in your mind, my mind, if we're going to experience the peace of God, if we're going to have a direct experience of our true nature of peace and love and joy and happiness and innocence. You are the innocent one. You've never been guilty. Humanity's never been guilty. We dreamed up this system of guilt. We dreamed up this system of sin and sorrow and sadness and punishment. We dreamed it up. How can a holy, righteous, loving God, loving Father create a system or create anything that is not like him? How can the loving God create an unloving system of punishment requiring sacrifices that did not come from God, that came from humanity and their guilt? When Moses went up into the mountain and grabbed those and came back down with the laws of God, the commandments of God, that weren't the commandments of God. That was guilt. Moses came back with those because Moses was what? Guilty. Moses was what? Fed up with the people. So when he came back down with laws that would what? Punish the people for what they kept doing. We call them the 10 Commandments. Well, really, we should call them Moses' commandments. God doesn't require. God doesn't require anything of his innocent creation. I know this is heavy, but it will lighten the load. It will eliminate the sin consciousness, the guilt, and fear in your mind. The thing that you was hoping for, the evidence you was looking for, is here. This is the substance of the thing hoped for, your innocence. This is the evidence of the thing that's not seen, your oneness. This is it. This is the mystery. This is the mystery that Paul had some idea of. Didn't have the whole idea. He had some. This is the mystery. This is the point where a lot of spiritual teachers get, but they can't quite say it because they feel like the people will go free if they knew that God don't require anything. So it says, if sin is real, then punishment is just. It's justified and cannot be escaped. So if sin is real, punishment is justified and can't be escaped. That's not a God idea. It says salvation cannot be purchased, but through suffering. Suffering would be the only way out. And that's why a lot of us still suffer and continue to suffer, even after we say we got a relationship with God, there's still a psychological and mental suffering. Why? Because there's still a sense of what sin consciousness, guilt, and fear. Why? Because we believe that sin is real. And so there's this what residual effect that lingers on even after we've asked God to forgive us, even after we've changed some things in our life, even after we've removed some things from our life. There's still a sense of guilt and judgment and condemnation. Why is that? This is why I'm explaining that it's there, because we believe that sin is real when in reality sin is not real. It's an illusion. It is an illusion because nothing really happened. What happened in dreams are not real. And so if sin is real, then happiness must be an illusion. So sin and happiness cannot be real. It's got to be either one or the other. Innocent and guilt can't exist. Either we're innocent or we're guilty. But see, in man's plan for salvation, man is guilty. But then he gets to go free because of a sacrifice, a punishment, a penance. That will never remove sin consciousness. You ask any human being. There's still this idea, there's still this fear that the judgment, that's why we say judgment day is coming. That you still have to be judged. That is not a God idea. Why would God judge his own creation? It's like judging himself. And if you had to judge yourself, you will always judge yourself as right. Always judge yourself as innocent. And so will God. He's not fooled. He's not a fool. And so salvation thus cannot be purchased but through suffering. If sin is real, then happiness must be an illusion, but they cannot both be true. Innocence and guilt cannot be true. Happiness and sin cannot both be true. It says the sinful warrants only death or deserves death and pain. And it is this that they ask for. For they know it waits for them, and it will seek them out and find them somewhere, sometime, in some form that evens the account they owe to God. And that's the sense that we have. When we embrace sin as real, you can crucify 1,000 Jesus or 1,000 cows, doesn't matter. It will not remove the sin consciousness. It would not remove the sense that there needs to be punishment and pain. And we all walk around wondering when the punishment and when the pain is going to come in our life. So all this is imagining in our mind, in our thinking. That's what needs to be healed. That is what needs to be healed in humanity. That's why we're spending these 365 days in mind training, because the mind needs to know its innocence. The mind needs to know that it was all dreamed up, made up. It was all the imagination of a separated self. That it never, ever happened. That it all was an illusion. All was an illusion in the mind of humanity. And when the mind is healed, and the mind can only be healed through accurate knowledge, revelation knowledge, direct awareness, direct consciousness that comes from the source itself. We are presenting those ideas in these studies, in these lessons. God's son and daughter is guiltless. And in their innocence is their salvation. In their innocence is their happiness. In your innocence is your what? Peace and joy. You can never really have sustained peace, joy, and happiness until you know you are innocent. Until you know you have not committed a crime against God. Until you know all that it appeared to be. It all happens in the dreams, in illusions, and in fantasies, and in wild imaginings. We imagined all this. Humanity did. In Genesis, it said that Adam fell asleep. But nowhere in Genesis does it say in the creation story that Adam ever woke up. And so Adam fell asleep dreaming of separation from God. Therefore, he hid himself from God. Therefore, he saw himself being kicked out of his home and put out into a world to fend for himself. And thus we have these thousands and thousands of years of history of killing and wrangling and all of the pain and hurt that we've seen. Systems of what? Systems of priesthood, systems of, systems of religion. Trying its best, very best, to have its conscience cleared from what it thought it did, all in a dream. In reality, nothing really happened. And so that's why we use terms like awakening. Humanity needs to wake up to the truth. Humanity needs to be enlightened to what reality is. Humanity needs to be born again. Humanity needs to come into the knowledge of the truth. And this Course in Miracles, that's why it calls a Course in Miracles. It's a course. Because we need to take an entire course to retrain our mind, to bring our prodigal mind back to the reality, to wake it up from the dream of separation. So we take this course that teaches us what reality is. And so it says, the sinful want only death and pain, and it is this that they ask for they know it waits for them, and it will seek them out and find them somewhere, sometime, in some form that even the account they owe to God. They would escape him in fear, and yet he will pursue, and they cannot escape. If sin is real, salvation must be pain. Pain is the cost of sin, and suffering can never be escaped. If sin is real, salvation must be feared, for it will kill but slowly, taking everything away before it grants the welcome boon of death to victims who are little more than bones before salvation is appeased. Its wrath is boundless, merciless, but wholly just. So this is what we've been conditioned in most of our upbringing. If you've been part of any organized religion, that's kind of the story. It starts with sin. It progresses to guilt. And it results in fear. So you have a whole society of beings in fear. Fear of God, fear of each other, fear of what's in the world. And then we have a fear-based theology that supports it. No wonder we're screwed up. No wonder we see where we are here in 2022 with all of the senseless killings through wars and fightings and divisions and mass shootings and everything that we see that's crazy. We say this world is crazy. Well, this is the reason why. It's in the mind of humanity. Until humanity's mind is healed from the belief that sin is real, it will continue. until until those that call themselves spiritual understand this, they will still grapple with what? The residual of sin, guilt, and fear. Even those that pray and meditate and pay tithes and offering and do all of these religious things out of a sense of, most cases, out of a sense of what? Fear, out of a sense of guilt, out of a sense of owing God something. Until we realize you don't owe God anything, there will not be the sweetness, there will not be the innocence, there will not be the equality that you can directly experience. It comes through the knowledge of the truth. Jesus said it is the truth that will set you free, not your, not your penance. It's the truth that sets you free. Even some of the scriptures gets it. It says what God what loves. He loves the sacrifice. He loves what? God loves what? Obedience and not sacrifice. What do you mean when we say obedience? Obedience to the awareness of the knowledge of the truth. God loves when his children come to know the truth, so there can be happiness and joy and peace and loveliness and equality versus sacrifices. We always want to bring God sacrifice. We want to build God something. We want to do something for God. Build a shrine, build a building, give this, give that, trying to deal with the sin, guilt, and fear that's in our awareness. And this sin, guilt, and fear is what the Course called blocks to the awareness of love's presence. We don't know the loveliness that we are until we remove these blocks. We have to move the block of the idea of that sin is real. It is not real. It's imagined. It's not real. You are sinless. You are guiltless. Just like your elder brother. He knew that. He knew that. Do you not think 33 years that Jesus did something that we would look at him and say, that's wrong, man, that's sin? He didn't think so, because he knew. So what? He knew sin. He knew sin was not real. If you knew all the details of Jesus' life, you would say he was a sinner from looking at what he did or said. But he didn't think so because he knew so. That's the only difference. Jesus didn't believe in sin. And so he came to share with us that sin is an illusion. And we said, no, we believe in it. It needs payment. So he said, okay. So he went through the act of crucifying and said, okay, I'm the sacrifice. Okay, so now you'll go free. And even in that, we still grapple with sin, consciousness, guilt, and fear. Why? Because we believe in that, if God really required that, that makes of him an unloving father. And if he killed an innocent son, don't you think there's punishment for us? I used to think that way so hard, man. And most of us do. In this Western world. So who would seek out such savage punishment? Who would not flee salvation and attempt in every way he can to drown the voice which offers it to him? Why would he try to listen and accept its offering? If sin is real, its offering is death, and mailed out in cruel form to match the vicious wishes in which sin is born. If sin is real, salvation has become your bitter enemy, the curse of God upon you who have crucified his son. You need the practice today. So we need this practice today that says what God's will for us is perfect happiness. Because now we have laid the groundwork, which tells us that The belief that sin is real is the block to the awareness of this happiness. So we need this lesson today. This is a very important lesson. And I'm going to pause this lesson right here, and I'm going to come back with the end of this lesson. So you come back or you watch for part 2. Okay? Thank you so much. I'll be back to finish lesson 101.